Welcome to episode 109 of the G2 on 5G. It's the latest inside scoop on everything 5G. We cover 6 topics in about 20 minutes, and it's brought to you by More Insights and Strategy. I'm Will Townsend, and joining me again this week is fellow analyst Anshel Sag. Let's get started with my first topic. So it is 2Q earnings season, and I did share some insights on Twitter about AT&T. They had a bang-up second quarter. Over 800,000 postpaid ads, profitability looks solid, fiber continues to have tremendous momentum. However, on the other hand, Verizon announced earnings, and it's a completely different story, completely different picture. Lower profits, flat revenue, and just 12,000 postpaid phone net additions compared to AT&T had over 800,012. And so it kind of begs the question, what is Verizon struggling with? And you and I have been talking about, they are probably presented with the biggest challenge with respect to deploying 5G, which is going to drive significant ARPU. There was a bright spot in their earnings. They did report some positive momentum with their fixed wireless access service, but the numbers are paltry in comparison to what T-Mobile is doing. And there were some announcements this week actually with T-Mobile and expanding that footprint into metropolitan areas for their FWA service. So I guess it begs the question, is there trouble in their 5G paradise? But I would love to get your perspective.
Yeah, honestly, I think I have a lot of thoughts. I don't think there's enough time for them in this podcast, honestly, because it'd be an hour long. But it would mostly be a rehash of what we've been talking about, which is Verizon's position in mid-band and their overall coverage and user experience in 5G are just simply inferior, and have been for almost the entirety of their 5G rollout. I think things are getting considerably better for them. But I recently went on a trip to LA and I took 3 phones with me, one on each carrier, admittedly not all the same phones. But I actually took a mid-band only phone on Verizon just to see what their mid-band coverage looks like. So there's no millimeter wave influence there.
Yeah.
And, I saw mid-band in more places than I expected, but my expectations were fairly low. But, T-Mobile absolutely crushed it. And AT&T was, I would say, not even that great in terms of speeds, but the consistency on AT&T was much better. So I think when you look at what users expect from their carriers, I think while high speeds are always good and coverage are important, I think consistency is really what's helping AT&T here. Because I'm sure people are tempted to go to T-Mobile from AT&T, but they also probably don't have that much of a negative experience in terms of coverage and speeds to feel like they have to go. And realistically, AT&T, I think relevant to this, when they announced their earnings, they said that their mid-band rollout is also accelerating faster than they expected, and that they'll have 100 million pops this year instead of 70 million. So I think AT&T will ramp and will continue to ramp next year. And I think by the end of next year, we'll have a very good idea of where everybody sits in terms of their 5G coverage and overall 5G experience, because I think by then, both Verizon and AT&T will have had enough time to fully, build out the majority of their networks. There will still be lots of holes to fill. But I think the other thing is that, this is going to be a multi-year effort, and there's going to be lots more things to do. And unfortunately, this is kind of a clear indication that Verizon is very much behind. Because these are kind of a trailing indicator, right? Net ads are usually something that trails the user experience, and it kind of validates what we've been saying over the last 6 to 12 months about Verizon's 5G network.
Yeah, they, and you and I have been speaking to this for quite some time, so we'll take our victory lap on it. They're definitely in last place with respect to getting this rolled out. And your insights on mid-band spectrum are dead on. I think from my perspective, AT&T has a slight advantage, not a slight advantage, but a pretty decent advantage over Verizon in mid-band. just because they didn't have as much gap fill. And they were pretty smart about their 110 auction spectrum acquisition as well, which provides good mid-band coverage at a very compelling price point relative to what C-band rung in at. So yeah, again, we'll continue to monitor this 5G race between all the big tier ones and Dish, their next I believe goal or that's set by the FCC is to hit to a certain coverage area by mid next year, and so that'll be interesting to track as well. But let's move to your first topic this week, and you want to talk about Samsung. They signed a deal with Mediacom, and this is focused on a CBRS spectrum powered FWA deployment.
Yeah, so Mediacom's an operator, and they will be deploying Samsung's CBRS wireless networking solutions for 5G FWA. And these are basically designed to reach approximately 1.5 million households and businesses across 22 states. So Mediacom's not necessarily the biggest of carriers, but they are a carrier, and they do have lots of customers. And really what this comes down to is they're kind of validating Samsung's strategy with how they're deploying CBRS.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because FWA obviously creates another opportunity for a carrier to deepen their relationship with customers. And Mediacom is definitely one of the more rural-like carriers. So this is kind of just a validation that Samsung isn't just winning their business with the larger carriers. And that Mediacom's FWA service, which is very similar to what a lot of other carriers are offering, maybe at a lower lower rate, because it's 60 bucks a month, which is still about what others are charging. But they're currently only offering 25 down, 3 up, with a 400 gig monthly cap. So it's not ideal, but I have a feeling that with CBRS, this could considerably increase those speeds and give people access to much faster internet, hopefully at the same price. So I think it's great that Samsung is a part of this solution. And I really think that Samsung has offered a good product for this kind of market, but also just being a very competitive third player in the market, which I think Huawei was to a degree, but I think there was a lot of questions about the state of Huawei's hardware and whether or not it was reliable for a lot of reasons. It was well priced and the performance was there, but a lot of people questioned its validity. And I just saw an article literally over the wire today that talked about how the US government was getting concerned about Huawei's infrastructure deployments in these kinds of rural areas because they're very close to military bases. That's actually why the whole rural carrier thing is actually a big deal, because they're concerned that Huawei switches and Huawei routers were way too close or even feeding into US military bases.
Yeah, no, that, I'm going to touch on this in my second topic, but I've got a few observations here. So yeah, I just spent time with Samsung Networks. They had an analyst day in Dallas last week, and I continue to be impressed with the momentum that they're building. One thing to bear in mind, if our viewers and listeners aren't aware of this, is that traditionally Samsung Networks was fairly weak in the RAN space. Obviously Ericsson and Nokia really ruled the roost there for obvious reasons. They've got bulletproof gear, but building upon kind of the momentum around Open RAN, which drives a domesticated supply chain, getting back to your point on rural America and the rip and replace of Chinese infrastructure, but they're also leaning into CBRS. And when you look at what's interesting about Samsung is obviously they're producing infrastructure, but they're producing world-class Android phones as well. They've had CBRS support on handsets for quite some time. This is a natural evolution. And actually what I would expect with CBRS, because that licensed spectrum is actually less costly, and you've got different license scenarios. You can go through general access or PAL. I would expect that those FWA services over time, not only to your point, would improve in performance, but actually decrease in overall subscriber payment. And T-Mobile's been very aggressive. I think they've got what, a $50 plan out there. And so I expect to see this certainly mature over time. But I totally agree with you, spot on. Samsung Networks has really started with Verizon with their mobile 5G deployment. They've really come a long way in the last few years to cement themselves as a solid third position infrastructure provider. But this plays into a great segue for my second topic this week. And I want to talk about the 5G fund. And you and I have talked about this on prior podcasts. So this is a federal fund that's been set aside, initially earmarked with $9 billion to assist in bridging the digital divide and helping these rural carriers get 5G deployed. And it's chicken and egg. So the average deployment cost for a mobile network, deploying 5G new radio is 20 to 25 billion. That's just the infrastructure. That is public record from AT&T and Verizon. So the question becomes, is it a realistic ask for the rural carriers to ask the federal government for more? And I do believe it is, just based on that stat that I just shared. And actually they have come back and they've recommended, we think about 36 billion might actually do the job. And from my perspective, that's very realistic. And one of the things you bear in mind with rural deployment, the way that operators are able to recoup their investment, obviously, is with subscribership. And the tier ones operate in very highly dense urban metropolitan areas, and they can recoup that investment, much more quickly. In rural America, I think you're going to have a lot of opportunity to connect 5G to agricultural sensors and that sort of thing, to improve crop yields and ranching and serving and that sort of thing. But when you look at the subscriber density in rural, it's not there. And so that payback could be 2, 3, 4x longer. So there definitely needs to be, from my perspective, some government subsidy to help rural America and help these carriers like US Cellular and Mediacom that you're talking about earlier. I don't know if the federal government needs to foot the entire bill, but it seems to me that that number is a lot bigger than 9 billion. But I bet you have a ton of insight on this topic.
Yeah, I think the issue is that this is not something that the operators chose to do. This is a mandate from the government. And I think if the government wants to mandate something, it needs to be funded, and not underfunded. So I think an independent study of what this actually will cost would be the most appropriate, because it sounds like the government is undercutting and the carriers are maybe overshooting a little bit.
Yeah.
But I
There's
think that
both of that going on for sure.
right. So I think there's probably something like, the rule of 80%, where like maybe you don't give the carriers 100% of what they're asking for, because it's probably unreasonable and they're probably asking for everything to be paid for.
Yeah.
And the government is probably, underestimating what it actually costs, because they don't want to have to ask for $36 billion. But ultimately, I think this is a mandate. There are lots of benefits to making this happen other than security. And I think the best thing to do, in my opinion, would be, if the government is going to up the funding, they could also up the requirements. Like, if we pay for this rip and replace to the degree you're asking for, well, we're going to ask for more than just rip and replace. We're going to ask for service guarantees or coverage guarantees or something, because I just think there needs to be more gained out of this than just replacing the hardware, if they want 100% of their costs covered.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think it's important to note that, and actually this was an enterprise, actually it was a light reading article. Our buddy Mike Dano wrote it. 3 billion is allocated for the rip and replace of Chinese infrastructure. So my understanding is that is incremental to the 9 billion. But I think you and I have talked about that funding is probably, it's nowhere nearly adequate given the deployment of Chinese infrastructure in rural America, because to your point, it was much more cost effective than comparable solutions from like Nokia and Ericsson. I mean, I heard stories, and I won't mention, either one of those European companies, but some of these tenders, I mean, it was unbelievable. It was, there was no profit in that, and so clearly Huawei was buying that to establish a foothold. And your insights are dead on. In rural America, a lot of this telecommunications infrastructure is close to critical infrastructure tied to the military. And so anyway, it's interesting, but certainly I think that 9 billion needs to be lifted. The final amount, who knows? The other thing I'll mention too is I think, again, I'm going to get on my soapbox again. I think the FCC needs to figure out a way to keep these spectrum auctions, from spiraling out of control and turning into these $80 billion behemoths, because that's a tax on the carriers as well. And it's not fair to a Verizon to spend 40 some odd billion, and then the federal government is turning around and subsidizing rural carriers just because their footprints in rural. So anyway, I could go all day about that, but let's
Yeah.
go to your second topic this week. And you want to talk about Singtel, and they've gone pretty close to meeting a pretty impressive standalone coverage goal.
Yeah, so Singtel said that back, they've been basically building their 5G network. Singtel is the primary carrier in Singapore. And they actually rolled out their standalone network in May of 2021. So they're one of the first in the world.
Yeah.
But they're claiming that they have 95% of their nationwide coverage, which, for those of you who are not aware of the size of Singapore, I like to call it a city state, because it's effectively a city that also happens to be a country, that resides within Malaysia. So it's not necessarily hard to achieve nationwide standalone coverage, but it is still an achievement. And I'm fairly sure, even if we were to look at all the cities around the world, 95% of them are not covered by standalone. So this is still quite an achievement. But Singtel is definitely one of the leading operators in the world in terms of deploying new technologies. They've always kind of been on the forefront of everything. So this doesn't really come as much of a surprise. But they did say that their standalone network covers 1,300 outdoor locations and 400 buildings across Singapore, which is really impressive. And that they have lots of test beds being built with the government. That's one of the things that's really cool about Singapore is the public-private partnerships are very close. There's lots of research that goes on in there. Lots of interesting things come out of Singapore as a result of that. And they said that they're doing 15 different live trials with standalone 5G. I expect to have 30 by the first half of 2023. So they're doing lots of interesting stuff with this network and using it as a test bed to enable new use cases. They're currently using 3.5 gigahertz, which is a globally harmonized band. And they are also using 2.1 gigahertz as well. And it'll be really interesting to see what this network is going to be able to achieve. And what's interesting is it's actually an Ericsson network. So it's got it's cloud native, it's got dual mode 5G core, and it's going to be something that I would love to be able to benchmark and test and see what they're I'm kind of curious to see that they haven't really talked about what latency latency latency
Right.
with this standalone network, but I have a feeling that they're probably a lot better than what they were before this network launched. So
Mhm.
it'll be interesting to see how Singtel's performance looks in the near future with all of this spectrum and standalone.
Yeah, you mentioned the size of Singapore. I've visited several times over the years, and it is a nation, city, state, all wrapped into one. I believe it's about the size of San Francisco. It's maybe I'm exaggerating that to a point, but it's not really mountainous based on my recollection, and so I think it's fairly easy to get there. But Singapore is also considered a financial center in Asia as well. And so I think a lot of the 5G use cases will be really, really interesting, sort of coming out of these test beds that you were talking about. And I love the Tiger beer. So every time I visit, I have to have a Tiger beer. But let's move to my third and final topic this week. And I want to talk about the Frankfurt Airport. And they're planning to deploy the largest private 5G campus network in Europe. And this will rival, I believe it's Hannover Messe that has staked that claim. I think I've spoken about that deployment with Inseego in the past, but the Frankfurt Airport is actually working with NTT, and NTT is their momentum is building around private. I think I've mentioned in the past that they have an investment interest in Solona, which is the 5G as a service solution that I've spoken to on other podcasts as well. But the question that kind of comes to my mind is like, so what would be some of the expected business outcomes from deploying a private 5G network? And so there are plans once it's deployed that there's going to be a model where other businesses, because an airport is like an ecosystem, and you have catering, you have restaurants, you have bars, you have hotel adjacencies and those sorts of things. So longer term, there'll be some sort of opportunity for these other entities that are in the sort of the airport ecosystem to leverage it. But initially, they're deploying 3.7 to 3.8 gigahertz, and they're going to use that for a number of different use cases, which include autonomous vehicle driving on what they call the apron, which is the tarmac. Automating kind of refueling scenarios, video-based monitoring of airport facilities, using drones as well, which requires really low latency. So this could be really a great use case and showcase for the airport of the future. But what do you think?
Yeah, I think I've actually been talking to Boingo and some others around airports and private 5G networks. So I think it's really interesting because there are lots of opportunities at airports to do compelling things. I think the number one is actually like just deploying millimeter wave everywhere, because it's not going to interfere with plane traffic, and it's not going to interfere with any of like the critical infrastructure that planes use, and it enables really fast downloads of content, which is really beneficial for Netflix, music, being able to just like get your content before you hop on the plane.
Right.
And then also for the planes themselves to both download and upload the data that's on those planes.
Because you have logs, you have pilot logs that have to be transferred, I believe, to the airport. And actually, this was an early WiMAX use case. If our viewers and listeners remember what WiMAX was, it was FWA, but it was kind of half baked from my perspective. But yeah, there are a lot of uses. I mean, it's a good point with millimeter wave to get that really, really fast throughput speed for download.
And I just recently was at Midway, which is not necessarily known as a very forward-thinking airport, but AT&T millimeter wave there was doing a gig per second, and it kind of blew away my T-Mobile and Verizon phones, because millimeter wave was working, and I'm sure other people were using it and had no idea that they were accessing this much faster band. And I think just when you look at when you're in a congested area like that, having just millimeter wave 5G alone, I think will drastically improve the experience, because in a lot of airports today, signal is bad, throughput is bad, and it's not a great experience. And when you're able to actually experience 5G to its greatest benefit, and with that kind of user density, it's very easy to justify.
Yeah, I'm waiting for Boingo to really improve their service. I hate to mean tweet on them, but I do that often. I'll also provide another insight to our viewers and listeners. I have found that Midway has the cheapest draft beer. So put that in your pocketbook there. But hey, buddy, let's move to your third topic. And you want to talk about Crown Castle. And I caught some of this news towards the tail end of the week too.
So I saw the Crown Castle news. It's interesting because a lot of people don't really understand outside of our industry how large Crown Castle really is.
Yeah.
But they have tens of thousands of cell sites. And if you're talking about adding the small cells to that, they're in the over 100,000 plus. So they said that they expect to double their small cell deployments in 2023. So this year they expect to deploy 5,000 small cells, but next year they expect to deploy 10,000, which is a doubling of that. And I think part of that is also the fact that they have commitments to deploy small cells with some of their existing customers. So they currently own and operate at least more than 40,000 cell towers, and they have approximately 85,000 route miles of fiber. So they have a very robust network in place, but they have an agreement that they signed with T-Mobile earlier this year, which I think we covered, that they would have a 12-year agreement with T-Mobile to build out their network to increase coverage with Crown Castle's towers and small cell locations, which includes access to 35,000 small cell sites. So that's probably a big part of that deployment and expansion. And it's very interesting because T-Mobile, the new T-Mobile that exists today, is already kind of a conglomerate or an aggregation of Sprint and T-Mobile's networks, which together were by far the most dense. And even with the divestment and shutdown of sites, I think they still have the most cell sites. So it's going to be interesting to see where they use these and how they use them. I have a feeling a lot of those small cells might end up being C-band in the because they have that higher end of the 3.7, 3.9 band. So I think that'll probably be a place where they use it a lot. And then also just, I think, filling in 2.5 in places where it might not be able to reach based on their current macro sites. So it's going to be very interesting to see how Crown Castle's network grows, but this will put them, well over 120,000 small cells across the country. Yeah.
You made a spot on point about kind of the nature of C-band and the requirement for densification. We've talked about that numerous times on our podcast series over the years. And I mean, this is something that Verizon really needs to jump on and take advantage of too, because if you look at, of all three of the tier one carriers, Verizon by far is deploying the most C-band spectrum. AT&T second with some 110 sprinkled in, and then certainly T-Mobile just sort of filled in, their gaps there because they had such an impressive overall footprint with the Sprint acquisition. But yeah, it's interesting. A lot of folks outside of our industry don't understand, Crown Castle and just their reach and how, critical they are from providing, that necessary real estate on towers and that sort of thing. But hey, it's been another great podcast. We probably went a little longer than 20 minutes, but why don't you take us home?
Absolutely. We hope our viewers and listeners found this week's topics interesting. If anyone out there would like to provide insights on a specific 5G topic for a future podcast, please reach out to us on social media. Will is at Whaletown Tech, and I'm at Anshel Sog. We hope you have a great weekend, and please tune in again next week.